It was 586 BCE when Jerusalem fell. The mighty Babylonian army had breached the walls, and King Nebuchadnezzar's forces stormed through the city streets. Amid the chaos and destruction, the unthinkable happened. Solomon's temple, the magnificent house of God that had stood for over 400 years, was ransacked and burned to the ground. The sacred vessels were carried away, the walls demolished, and the people of Judah were marched off to exile. In that moment, the question became more urgent than ever before. If God's dwelling place on earth was destroyed, how could the people maintain their connection with Him? Where was God's presence now? And most importantly, who could approach this God, even without a temple? These questions weren't new. Centuries before this catastrophic event, King David had already provided an answer, not in stone and cedar like his son Solomon would later build, but in words that would outlast any physical structure. In the 15th Psalm, David addressed the fundamental question that resonates across time: Lord, who may dwell in your sacred tent? Who may live on your holy mountain? The answer to this question isn't about magnificent buildings or elaborate rituals. It's about character. It's about integrity. It's about living a life that reflects God's own nature. Today, we're going to explore Psalm 15, a brief but profound text that outlines the qualities of those who can dwell in God's presence. Though composed around 1000 BCE during David's reign, these words offer timeless wisdom about the kind of person who can approach the holy God and stand in His presence. Main content. Let's begin by reading Psalm 15 in its entirety. Lord, who may dwell in your sacred tent? Who may live on your holy mountain? The one whose walk is blameless, who does what is righteous, who speaks the truth from their heart, whose tongue utters no slander, who does no wrong to a neighbor, and casts no slur on others, who despises a vile person but honors those who fear the Lord, who keeps an oath even when it hurts, and does not change their mind, who lends money to the poor without interest, who does not accept a bribe against the innocent. Whoever does these things will never be shaken. This psalm was written during a pivotal period in Israel's history. After centuries of wandering and warfare, the nation had finally found stability under King David's rule. The Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of God's presence, had been brought to Jerusalem around 1000 BCE. David himself had established his capital there, transforming what was once a Jebusite stronghold into the city of David. Yet even in this time of triumph and settlement, David recognized something profound: proximity to sacred space didn't automatically grant access to God's presence. The question wasn't just about physical closeness to the tabernacle, it was about spiritual readiness to enter God's presence. The psalm begins with a question that might seem simple but carries tremendous theological weight: Lord, who may dwell in your sacred tent? Who may live on your holy mountain? In David's time, the sacred tent referred to the tabernacle, the portable sanctuary that housed the Ark of the Covenant before the temple was built. The holy mountain was Mount Zion, where Jerusalem stood. But these physical locations represented something far greater. They were earthly representations of God's heavenly dwelling. The question, then, is really asking, who is worthy to be in God's presence? What follows is not a list of ritual requirements or ceremonial qualifications. There's no mention of sacrifices, priestly lineage, or specific religious observances. Instead, David outlines 11 moral qualities that characterize the person who can dwell with God. First, the one whose walk is blameless, who does what is righteous. The Hebrew word for blameless is tamim, which doesn't mean sinless perfection but rather integrity and wholeness. It describes someone whose life has a consistent moral direction, not divided or hypocritical. This person doesn't merely appear righteous, they actively do what is right. Historical context matters here. In 1000 BCE, the ancient Near East was filled with religious systems that emphasized ritual purity and ceremonial correctness. Yet here, David emphasizes ethical behavior and moral character instead. This aligns with the prophetic tradition that would later emerge in Israel, where figures like Amos, around 760 BCE, would declare, I despise your religious festivals. But let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. Next, the psalm describes someone who speaks the truth from their heart. This isn't just about avoiding outright lies, it's about living with authenticity. The ancient Hebrew concept of truth, emet, encompasses reliability, firmness, and faithfulness. Speaking truth from the heart means one's words match their innermost convictions. The psalm continues with qualities related to speech and relationships, whose tongue utters no slander, who does no wrong to a neighbor, and casts no slur on others. In a society where reputation was everything and communities were tightly knit, slanderous speech could destroy lives. The Hebrew term for slander, rakil, literally refers to someone who travels around spreading malicious reports, a gossip whose words cause division and pain. In ancient Israel around David's time, communities functioned on trust and mutual dependence. Agricultural work required cooperation, protection from enemies demanded unity. Slanderous speech threatened the very fabric that held society together. By prohibiting such destructive communication, the psalm wasn't just making a moral point, it was preserving community cohesion. The psalm then shifts to how we evaluate others, who despises a vile person but honors those who fear the Lord. This isn't advocating personal contempt but rather a clear moral discernment. The righteous person doesn't admire those who reject God's ways, regardless of their wealth, power, or status. Instead, they honor those who fear the Lord, those who live with reverent awe toward God, regardless of their social standing. This was countercultural in David's time, when social hierarchies were rigid and status was often determined by birth or wealth. The psalm suggests a different value system, one where character matters more than credentials, and reverence for God outweighs worldly achievements. Next comes one of the most challenging requirements, who keeps an oath even when it hurts, and does not change their mind. In a world without written contracts or legal enforcement mechanisms, verbal promises were the foundation of business, marriage, and political alliances. The person who honors their word, even when circumstances change and keeping the promise becomes costly, builds a reputation for reliability that reflects God's own faithfulness. Historical records from the ancient Near East reveal numerous treaties and covenants between nations and individuals. These agreements often included elaborate ceremonies and invoked divine witnesses. By emphasizing oath-keeping, Psalm 15 places personal integrity within this covenantal framework. Just as God keeps his promises to Israel, the righteous person keeps promises to others. The final ethical requirements deal with economic justice, who lends money to the poor without interest, who does not accept a bribe against the innocent. These principles directly challenged exploitative practices common in ancient economies. Charging interest to fellow Israelites, especially the poor, was explicitly forbidden in the Torah, Exodus 22 verse 25, yet the prohibition was frequently ignored. Similarly, bribery corrupted justice throughout the ancient world, allowing the wealthy to escape consequences while the poor suffered. By including these economic practices, Psalm 15 makes clear that our relationship with God cannot be separated from our relationship with money and power. True righteousness extends to financial dealings and the exercise of influence. The psalm concludes with a powerful promise: whoever does these things will never be shaken. The image evokes a person standing firmly on solid ground, unaffected by storms or earthquakes. In a region prone to actual seismic activity, where trembling ground was a lived experience, this metaphor would have resonated powerfully with its original audience. But what does this promise mean? It doesn't guarantee freedom from difficulties or suffering. Rather, it suggests that the person of integrity has built their life on something unshakable, God's own character. When troubles come, as they inevitably do, this person stands firm because their foundation is secure. Throughout Israel's history, this message proved prophetic. When Jerusalem fell in 586 BCE and the temple was destroyed, many thought God's presence had abandoned them. Yet prophets like Ezekiel declared that God remained with his people even in Babylonian exile. Those who lived with integrity could still dwell in God's tent, even when the physical tent no longer existed. This understanding transformed Jewish religious identity. During the Babylonian exile, 586 to 538 BCE, and beyond, Jews developed practices that maintained their connection with God without a temple. Synagogues emerged as places of prayer and study. Daily ethical living became the primary way of honoring God rather than temple sacrifices. When we look at Psalm 15 through this historical lens, we see its revolutionary nature. It redefined holiness from being primarily about sacred space to being about sacred character. God's presence wasn't limited to a building, it was accessible to anyone who lived with integrity. The influence of this psalm extends far beyond its original context. We can trace its ethical principles through the teachings of the prophets, into the writings of Second Temple Judaism, and ultimately into the teachings of Jesus himself, who similarly emphasized character over ceremonial correctness. Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, around 30 CE, echoes many of the qualities found in Psalm 15. When he declares, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God," Matthew 5 verse 8, he's building on this psalm's foundation, that access to God's presence comes through integrity of heart rather than external observance. The Apostle James, writing around 45 to 50 CE, likewise drew on this tradition when he defined religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless, as caring for orphans and widows and keeping oneself unstained by the world, James 1 verse 27. This practical, ethical focus mirrors Psalm 15's emphasis on righteous living. Throughout church history, Psalm 15 has served as a mirror for self-examination. Augustine of Hippo, 354 to 430 CE, used it as a framework for assessing Christian character. Medieval monastics recited it as part of their regular devotional practice, seeing in it a blueprint for communal living. During the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, figures like Martin Luther and John Calvin emphasized its teaching that righteousness comes not from religious rituals but from faith that produces ethical living. Calvin specifically noted that Psalm 15 doesn't establish the basis for salvation, which is God's grace, but rather describes the evidence of one who is in relationship with God. Even in our modern context, Psalm 15's principles remain startlingly relevant. In an age of fake news and alternative facts, speaking truth from the heart still matters. In economies built on debt and consumption, ethical financial dealings still reflect God's character. In polarized societies, refusing to slander neighbors still builds community. But there's an important theological tension we must acknowledge. Psalm 15 presents high standards, standards that none of us consistently meet. If these qualities determine who can dwell with God, don't we all fall short? This is where the broader biblical narrative provides context. The psalm isn't suggesting that perfect moral performance earns God's presence. Rather, it describes the character that naturally develops in those who are in relationship with God. The righteous person strives for these qualities not to earn God's favor but because they have already experienced it. In Christian understanding, this relates to what theologians call sanctification, the process by which those who have been justified by faith are gradually transformed into Christ's likeness. The qualities in Psalm 15 become both goal and guide for this transformation. The Jewish tradition similarly understands these qualities as both gift and task. The rabbis taught that while Torah observance was essential, its purpose was to shape character and community. As the Talmudic sage Hillel, c. 110 BCE, 10 CE, famously summarized, "What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor." That is the whole Torah, the rest is commentary. Now go and study it. This brings us back to the Psalm's opening question, Lord, who may dwell in your sacred tent? The answer isn't meant to exclude but to invite, to call us toward a life of integrity that reflects God's own character. For those in David's time, approaching God's presence in the tabernacle required ritual purity. But Psalm 15 suggests that moral purity matters even more. For those after the temple's destruction, the psalm offered reassurance that God's presence remained accessible through righteous living. For us today, it reminds us that encountering God isn't primarily about sacred spaces but sacred lives. So how do we apply these ancient words to our modern lives? Let's consider each quality in contemporary terms. Walking blamelessly means living with integrity, ensuring our private actions align with our public proclamations. Speaking truth from the heart means being authentic, avoiding both outright lies and subtle deceptions that distort reality. Refusing to slander means using our words to build up rather than tear down, especially in a digital age where harmful words can spread instantaneously. Doing no wrong to neighbors extends to how we treat the stranger, the foreigner, and even those who oppose us politically or theologically. Honoring those who fear the Lord means valuing godly character over worldly success, celebrity, or power. Keeping promises even when it hurts means maintaining commitments even when circumstances change and fulfilling obligations becomes difficult or costly. Lending without interest doesn't necessarily prohibit all modern financial transactions but calls us to generosity and fairness, especially toward those in need. Refusing bribes means maintaining integrity in all professional and personal dealings, never using position or influence for unjust gain. These principles aren't just individual virtues, they are community-building practices. When lived out collectively, they create environments where justice, truth, and compassion flourish. As we conclude our exploration of Psalm 15, let's return to where we began, with that fundamental question, Lord, who may dwell in your sacred tent? Who may live on your holy mountain? The answer isn't about physical location or religious ritual. It's about character, a character shaped by relationship with God and expressed in relationship with others. It's about integrity that reflects God's own faithfulness. It's about truth that echoes God's reliability. It's about justice that mirrors God's righteousness. This psalm reminds us that approaching God's presence isn't primarily about entering sacred spaces but about becoming sacred people, people whose lives are aligned with God's character and purposes. The promise remains, those who live this way will never be shaken. Not because they are perfect, but because they are building their lives on the unshakable foundation of God's truth and love. Not because they never face storms, but because they are anchored to something, someone, who remains steady when everything else trembles. In our world of shifting values and uncertain foundations, Psalm 15 calls us to build lives of integrity that can withstand whatever challenges come. It invites us to dwell with God not just in sacred buildings but in every aspect of our daily existence. And it assures us that when we align our character with God's, we find not only stability but also intimacy with the divine. The question isn't just, who may dwell with God, but, who are we becoming as we dwell with Him? May our answer be found not merely in our words but in lives of integrity that reflect the character of the God we serve. Before you go, I want to personally invite you to be part of our growing community here at Prayer Universe. If this video touched your heart or brought you peace, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a prayer or message that can uplift your spirit. But most importantly, I'd love to hear from you. In the comments below, share just one word or phrase of motivation that this video inspired in you, whether it's hope, gratitude, peace, or something else. Your words matter deeply to us because they help guide the content we create for this channel. Together, let's build a space filled with faith, encouragement, and connection. Thank you for being here, and remember, every prayer counts. See you in the next one.